They told me, son, you're special. You were born to do great things. You know what? They were right.
That animated masterpiece that you just feasted your eyes on was my earliest memory of BioShock from many years ago. I actually saw the second game sitting on the shelf at my local GameStop. I silently studied the intriguing cover. BioShock. I had never seen that word, nor a pair of characters like them before. I stood there in a trance, intently studying the hulking scuba diver with a giant drill for a hand, and a young brown-haired girl with glowing yellow eyes casually perched on their shoulder. Although all of this did catch my eye, it quickly dissipated from my memory, and I never thought too much of it for a long while. I was still too young to be playing an M-rated game anyway, and was also heavily addicted to the sacred art of catching and battling against virtual creatures. Little did I know that one day I would too, with my wrench and lightning in hand, come face to face with that same deadly dynamic duo when I would inevitably plunge down into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, making a visit to the broken and demented city of Rapture. And after I made my return to the surface, I would stamp the original BioShock as one of my favorite video games of all time. I had intended to post a Let's Play of BioShock on my YouTube channel back in the beginning of 2017. I knew next to nothing about the game except that it had been rotting in my Steam library for an inexcusably long time. I finally stopped the procrastinating and being such a pussy, and had started my first ever playthrough completely blind. Here's how it went. I almost died in a plane crash, swam over to the conveniently placed entrance to Atlantis, made a friend over the radio after watching his get brutally gutted by a crackhead with fish hooks, injected myself with heroin, and almost died. Twice. And right before I continued my trek into some rich prick's busted dream, I stopped playing. Yeah, I just shut off the game, and did not load it up again for another 3 years. Bad move. Actually, it might have been for the best, because I have a good feeling that my impressionable 17-year-old brain would have been blown into billions of microfibers and jerked the story off harder than the diehard fans do for the third installment. It wouldn't be until the start of the new year, January 2020, that I would give the game another chance. By this time, I had watched other retrospectives on it, specifically these two, and knew how the game plays as well as what it was about, so nothing was a surprise. But despite all of that, BioShock pulled me in, spliced me up, and captivated me in ways that very few video games have managed to do over the course of my life. It was an experience filled with dread and loss, ugly spectacles and hard truths, ideology and identity, and almost 2 years after I was first thrown into the wacky realm of 2K's magnum opus, its world and the people that inhabit it still have me reminiscing of the first time I spent there. It's definitely one of my most memorable experiences in my time playing video games. With that being said, however, things are definitely not all sunshine and rainbows down here in this human fish tank. Although it's no secret that BioShock has incredible level design that not many of its competitors can match, and tells a tale that's anything but forgettable, with an intricately crafted backstory of Rapture's rise and fall, that doesn't mean the gameplay side of things is deserving of the same praise. In my opinion, the weapons, plasmids, tonics, are the weakest parts about BioShock, although plasmids are much better than the standard gunplay. First of all, right off the bat, having to constantly switch between your guns and plasmids mid-firefight is absolutely atrocious. I don't know why you can't just have both of them on the screen at the same time, but it drags everything down a peg and makes it way more frustrating than it has to be. Not only that, but you also have to sit through your weapon's reload animation every single time you want to use a different ammo type. which would make sense in real life, but I'd rather subtract a mechanical annoyance to make the game as satisfying as possible than keep that thorn firmly stuck in my dick in the name of being more realistic. In BioShock, you have no inventory to keep track of your items whatsoever, as you're forced to pick up everything you find from enemies in safes, but you also have such a small cap on ammo and money with absolutely zero methods to increase them. This is made even more irritating when you quickly realize how much supplies the game has to offer in every orifice of the city. I can't even begin to tell you how many times you'll walk into a room, start mashing your interact button on everything you see, only to hear a sound of thumping in your ear, and next thing you know, you end up just walking out with nothing as if you never went in the first place. As anyone who's played the game before, you know that this scenario is quite the recurring theme as you journey through the endgame. I don't understand why you can only hold such a limited amount of ammo and money when they're given out like candy on Halloween. I think BioShock would have benefited from allowing the player to choose what they can take and leave to improve exploration and make the surplus of items more reasonable. And if there's not going to be a lot of wiggle room as to how much ammo and money you can hold on to, then there shouldn't be boatloads of either teasing you every step of the way. Why not have a larger cap on ammo and money, but reduce the amount you find in the environment? Having a larger space to carry items lets you choose if you want to use a moderate sum of ammo and money all throughout the game, or save up to take some weight off your shoulders to tackle the hardest parts of it. Being able to find less items would always make sure to keep you on your toes and remind you to not be so careless with how you use your resources. As for the weapons you come across throughout your journey, they're nothing to write home about. Your collection of run-of-the-mill machines functions similarly to drinking milk that's been sitting on the counter for a few days because your idiot sibling forgot to put the carton back in the fridge. At least when it comes to some of them. I would like to note that I don't have a problem with the more traditional guns in the beginning, but I do think they steadily become worse as the game goes on, especially when the splicers gain quite the health kick. The pistol is one of only 2 weapons with precise enough reticules to land headshots, and you can argue that the machine gun and shotgun are the complete opposite, being awkward and clunky to shoot. Even when the game was released back in 2007, people rightfully voiced their opinions on the janky gunplay, and it has not aged well. It doesn't even look or feel like the bullets are coming out of the guns at all. It's as if you are an Olympic referee who loaded them with blanks to mark the start of a swimming race. So what these guns are firing are bad, but it's how they fire that's even worse. The aiming encourages sloppy play, and the crosshairs are not satisfying to target through in the slightest. It's more excusable for the shotgun, but the machine gun does not deal any sort of locational damage, and the bullets have a tendency to trail off. It also suffers from heavy recoil, causing the gun to veer upwards if you fire for too long. You have to treat it like a semi-automatic weapon and repeatedly tap the fire button if you want to improve your accuracy and make the bullets connect. And even with the damage upgrades that the power to the people stations provide, the effectiveness of all 3 completely plummets later in the game when the splicers gain a massive increase to their health, having the player fall back on anti-personnel rounds and the research camera to even the playing field, which I'll get to in a minute. The chemical thrower and grenade launcher are more special types of weapons that make it harder to be used on a regular basis, and they will most likely be saved for fighting the big daddies you come across in every level anyway. But the crossbow is, by far, the most busted of the primary firearms, dealing the highest amount of damage out of the bunch, and the bolts can even be reused. It's the most reliable weapon for the end of the game that will need to see a chiropractor afterwards, because it will be busy carrying your underwater ass. You can also craft certain ammo types at different U-invent stations in the game to your heart's content, as long as you have the required materials. I like these invention stations because it helps to replenish your most sought-after types of ammo that will be the most effective against the splicers like anti-personnel rounds, or fuel for the chemical thrower. They can also allow you to get more use out of other special weapons like the grenade launcher at a consistent rate. Aside from some of the shooting being poorly constructed, the persistent hand-holding through an overabundance of supplies turns the game into somewhat of a cakewalk, even on the hardest difficulty. There's also no penalty for dying either, so regardless if you're low on ammo or not, you can just keep running in guns and or wrenches blazing until you get past the part that you're stuck on. On top of that, the enemies don't regenerate their health, sucking any and all challenges that were left in the stash. Thankfully, you can disable vital chambers to actually remind yourself, hey, dying is not good. But the fact that you can save the game at any point that you wish completely undermines this option and is practically screaming to be abused. The same thing could be said about the research camera you require pretty early on in Neptune's Bounty. You can take pictures of any enemy in the game, including splicers, big daddies, bots, and turrets to gain permanent damage bonuses against them in addition to other rewards. The more pictures you take of a certain enemy type, the more score you contribute to them. It's possible to take multiple shots of the same enemy, but it won't give you as much score compared to the first unless you get an action shot or multiple subjects in one photo. I guess it was meant to balance out the absurd health increase the enemies receive throughout the endgame, but the power dynamic shifts too far in your favor, from Soul Level 1 versus ONS to untouchable Mewtwo level killing machine, as the triple plus bonus grants you a 45% increase in damage for that enemy type for the rest of the game. You can carry up to 100 film strips at a time, and you can also buy film from certain Circus of Value vending machines to give yourself an even bigger head start. I wish the camera wasn't so overpowered, or if it was just removed altogether, along with the arbitrary spike in enemy health later in the game. On the contrary, hacking can also kick rocks as well, being no stranger to overstaying its welcome. It's a tedious process that immediately kills the pace and the vibe cold turkey. There are gene tonics and plasmids you can use to make it easier on yourself, but that doesn't make up for the mind-numbing boredom that is present in every single attempt to turn a machine green. It sucks balls and any sane person knows it. Nowadays, I just buy out or auto-hack every piece of machinery and vault that I come across so as to not kill the pacing. But how do all of these weapons operate as a unit? During your stay in Rapture, you are, ironically, a jack of all trades. BioShock provides you with all the tools it has to offer for you to experiment with. Your primary firearms have 2 upgrades each to take advantage of, and there are just enough power to the people stations to get every upgrade for every weapon if you can successfully find them all. And while I do acknowledge that this more simple and accessible approach gives the player more variety in their arsenal every time they start a new game, while also trying to appeal to a wider market, I cannot deny that I dislike that BioShock does not allow for developing your own unique style of how you go about completing the game through more intricate stat trees. I would much rather be great with 1 weapon and 1 plasmid, or 1 weapon and 2 plasmids and vice versa, instead of being decent with all of them. Reducing the amount of power to the people machines and adding a 3rd or even 4th crazy good and cool looking upgrade to each weapon would not only make your favorite one in the game extremely effective throughout the whole thing, but it would also make your choice important and really forces you to think about the build you're trying to pursue and why. And in my opinion, the janky mechanics would be infinitely more forgivable if you could actually specialize in a certain weapon or plasmid with the option to improve your guns and plasmids of choice 3 to 4 times over. Throwing all of the weapons at you with the stations necessary to upgrade them 2 times each doesn't make them feel any more unique or useful than the other. I'd want to come back for multiple times to enjoy the variety of each individual playstyle that you can complete the game with to an excellent degree. This leads me to make the argument that returning playthroughs aren't as remarkable as the first, because 1, you can only experience the story once, and 2, while you are given everything to make new moments happen and being able to handle a myriad of different combat situations, it's ultimately the same song and dance at the core of it all. You are guaranteed to get all of the same weapons with the same generic upgrades every time. Reruns become formulaic and downright obnoxious at some points, and it doesn't take long for it to become incredibly stale. It's not as exciting as I would prefer, but as it stands though, the primary weapons in combat and how they function together aren't terrible by any means. The system could definitely be better in my opinion, but they get the job done. I see and can respect what they were trying to do, and I still can enjoy using them all at once with the upgrades they provide, and that's largely due to the levels these combat encounters are present in and the narrative roller coaster you're taken along for. And trust me, I'll get to all of that. But of course, your guns are just one part of how you fight in BioShock, as you also have the magical powers called plasmids at your disposal as well, and gene tonics to provide passive buffs to your character. I do think that plasmids are easily the better half of BioShock's weaponry, being more visually and thematically unique, and it allows for more creativity in conjunction with your primary weapons. Electrobolt, Incinerate, and Winter's Blast are the big 3, and are the ones that you'll probably be using the most and have, arguably, the highest level of usefulness in the game. Electrobolt can shut down bots and turrets, and stun splicers in place, dealing more damage to them if you shock the water if they are standing in any. Incinerate can illuminate a single target instantly and deal splash damage to surrounding enemies, as well as set fire to oil slicks on the ground. And Winter's Blast can freeze enemies completely solid, requiring less hits to defeat them and making hacking an easier ordeal to tolerate. You can see how those 3 plasmids in particular would reign king just from hearing about them. That doesn't mean it isn't impossible to get good usage out of most of the other ones though. Telekinesis is not that far behind and is no slouch in power at all. You can pick up any interactable object and release it with a good old Shinra Tensei, with considerable force and blinding speed. The heavier the object, the more damage you'll deal. It's a blast to use. Also quite funny, and doesn't cost that much EVE either. Insect Swarm is similar to Incinerate, being less powerful, but better at crowd control and distracting enemies. Security Bullseye coats enemies in a blue vortex, causing all turrets and cameras to target them on sight. This makes it an extremely useful and effective way to kill big daddies. Target Dummy also serves as a great decoy that works on all enemies. You can immediately get splicers, bots, turrets, and big daddies alike off your back, giving you a chance to run. It can also make it easier to sneak up on turrets to hack them. Enrage and Hypnotize Big Daddy are basically the same plasmid, except Enrage can only be used on regular splicers and the other only on big daddies. The former isn't really that good at killing other splicers, but ends up being better as another distraction type plasmid, while the latter gives you a powerful Metal Man ally for a few minutes. However, the cost of EVE is massive, draining your entire bar with just one use, even if you have all the EVE upgrades in the game. I would have liked for these two to be combined into one plasmid, since they basically do the same thing. That way, it can be used more often and would have allowed for a new type of plasmid that could have filled the spot. The only two plasmids that are the weakest in my opinion are Cyclone Trap and Sonic Boom, as they can only be used on splicers and the low damage output is not worth the high EVE cost. The former is damn near obsolete because proximity mines and trap bolts are superior in every way, but it's still pretty comical to use. So as you can see, plasmids are a nice complement to your primary firearms and take the combat to new heights when the gunplay can be pretty lackluster. At the same time, however, it would have been amazing if they gave plasmids more upgrades and stat boosts, or effects along with your guns to make them feel more unique to the player's vision. Regardless, I don't mind plasmids on the gameplay front at all, and I think they make BioShock stand out among other first-person shooters and survival horror games in the respective genres. Gene tonics can be defined as being light RPG elements that you can utilize throughout the whole game. They are split into three categories: physical, engineering, and combat. They give you passive buffs that can range from increasing your damage research to easing the hacking difficulties and avoiding security cameras quicker. I'm obviously not going to go through all of them here because there are a myriad of them to reasonably discuss, but in my opinion, most of them are just kind of there, and it's only a handful of them that are considered extremely useful all the way through the game, like Focused Hacker and Medical Expert. But others can be astronomically powerful if you pair it with specific tonics. Bloodlust is a prime example of this, as combining it with Wrench Jockey, Sport Boost, and Wrench Lurker can allow you to quite literally run a train on entire rooms with ease using just the wrench by itself, big daddies and the final boss included. It's ridiculous in the best way possible. Things like a wrench-only run, which I've done before on the hardest difficulty, are more of what I would want when it comes to the guns and plasmids. It may seem silly to clobber the heads of every Rapture citizen in the entire game with just a wrench, but it was my personal gameplay decision as to how I was going to beat the game. I know I've been stressing the idea of specialization a lot so far, but my goal for one of my first ever retrospectives is to be honest about my personal critiques of how I think BioShock could have been more successful on the gameplay side of things, even if people disagree. I want to reiterate in case it isn't clear that I don't completely hate BioShock's weapon system and being okay with all of the weapons. It's just not my preferred way to play, and I would rather be stellar at one or two things. So that's how you fight and what you fight with. But what are you actually fighting? Rapture's drugged up citizens, commonly referred to by the slang term called splicers, come in many forms, ranging from melee fighters to gunslingers to grenade throwers, and even utilizing plasmids by throwing fireballs and teleporting. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. Spider splicers are more agile, but don't have as much health, and also sport different resistances to knock some areas of your arsenal down a peg. Nitro splicers are resistant to fire, for example. By the time you reach Hephaestus, the thuggish splicers can become electrified, gaining an increased resistance to your Electrobolt. I love additions like this because it forces you to utilize everything you have and work around the obstacles in your way instead of barreling through the game with a single tactic for hours on end. Well, maybe this doesn't apply to a wrench-only run, but the point still stands. You also go up against mini-bosses like Dr. Steinman, Peach Wilkins, and Sander Cohen that are not much different from any Leadhead, Nitro, or Houdini splicer respectively, but are more thematically interesting and better reflect the insanity and paranoia of Rapture that they all became consumed with. The regular enemies you face off against are good, but the big daddies are even better and always make for an exciting challenge. Setting traps for them and strategically planning out how you will go about taking them down is fun as hell, and they're easily the best enemy to butt heads with in BioShock's combat. The bouncers are the iconic big daddies on the cover of the game that brandish an incredibly dark and morbid design visually. They're smaller but surprisingly fast and fuck shit up on the melee front. The Rosies are much taller and larger but don't move around as much as the bouncers. They're more tactical and keep their distance, picking you off with their rivet guns from afar. I do wish that there were more than 2 types of them though. Another thing that pisses me off is that they can also hit you unreasonably quick if you stay too close to them, dealing damage in an instant with no warning and no telegraph for their attacks. It's frustrating, but it doesn't take away from the encounters to where it's too much of an issue. So if BioShock's gameplay is a pretty mixed bag at best, how is it possible that it could be released to critical acclaim and has since stood the test of time in the minds of countless fans as being the GOAT 14 years later? It's not so much the combat itself, but where the combat takes place is the culprit that more than makes up for BioShock's consistently mediocre game and gunplay. The level design is unequivocally the strongest aspect in the physical realm of the original BioShock and in the entire series as well. There is never a dull moment exploring the underwater utopia, and there are plenty of optional areas to uncover from start to finish. Whether you're roaming the artistic apotheosis that is Fort Frolic or the gloomy gardens of Arcadia, every level feels authentic and genuine in a way that paints Rapture as a real place that could actually exist. It's as if they constructed the world first and then built a game around it afterward. Each location is so colorful and also has a specific purpose that keeps the wheels of Rapture turning. Neptune's bounty is a home for Fontaine fisheries to acquire a strong source of food, and Hephaestus is the main power source for the entire city. Some areas don't have any gameplay purpose at all and are just there to add to the already booming atmosphere and surroundings. On top of that, the Art Deco styling in all facets of Rapture is not only beautiful, but also is accurate to the time period. Couple that with musicians like Billie Holiday, the Ink Spots, and the Faux Frenchmen elegantly singing and playing their old school sounds through crackling record players scattered around. Unfortunately, it's not all fine and dandy, as the game does have its fair share of doo-doo levels. Point Prometheus marks the beginning of the shitstorm that is the ending of the game, and while I love the look of this war-torn science wing of Rapture that has multiple branching paths to venture through, it's by this point that the shooting mechanics and systems like hacking really start to get on your nerves. The level that precedes it, however, is the Proving Grounds, and it's just as bad. Everyone's favorite part of the game is infamously terrible, mostly for playing as a poor man's version of a Big Daddy, if you can even call it that. It's more like Jack with a snow globe on his head, as if he's about to audition for the role of the Cyclops in the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. And having to peer through this damn microscope as a little sister yaps in your ear to hurry up and that there's no time to waste endlessly does not make it any better. Oh yeah, by the way, did you know that angels don't wait for slowpokes? Anywho, Proving Grounds is the most linear level in the entire series, with swarms of enemies hounding your every move, with turrets and cameras galore around each corner. It's exhausting. At least you get to fight a Big Daddy at the end, so that's a little more thrilling, I guess. Okay, so the end sequence isn't all that impressive, but that doesn't diminish what the previous levels before it were able to accomplish. Rapture is expansive, vibrant, moody, and naturalistic, accompanied by an incredible attention to detail. It confidently parades its environments at every turn to the point where it makes you feel like you're doing more than just playing a game with guns and magic. And I think that's one huge reason why the actual gameplay isn't as criticized as much as it probably should be. Remember, this is a first-person shooter that was released in the same year as Team Fortress 2, Half-Life 2, Crysis, Mass Effect, Call of Duty 4, and Halo 3. Throwing BioShock in the middle of all that makes it stick out like a sore thumb, and is obviously outclassed mechanically by all of these legendary FPS titles. But the same argument can also be made the other way around from a thematic and creative standpoint. BioShock has gained the reputation of being one of the greatest video games ever made, despite not actually having any superb gameplay, and it cleverly gets away with it, not only because of its masterfully crafted underwater city with the intriguing complexity of its levels, but even more so because of the story it tells. Unlike most AAA games that were released in 2007, BioShock possesses a beautifully cohesive and concise backstory on everything contained in its world, from the minor and major characters that are a part of the city's history, to the growth, peak, and fall of the city itself. Rapture is surprisingly believable for a city underwater with citizens that could rewrite their genetics to form superpowers, and one character after another just oozes charisma through every audio diary you can get your hands on. The voice acting is superb, with powerful performances regardless if they have only one audio diary like Pierre Gabi, or a complete character arc like Sullivan, although the characters do have their funny hiccups. It's such a satisfying way to tell a story, and it fits the bill for a civilization already destroyed and decayed. Thankfully, there's no forced cutscenes like most of the overrated movie games that have come out in the past few years, and there's no reason to stop and read text logs every few minutes to piece together the lore. It trusts the player to put two and two together by themselves, and listening to them is totally optional as well. And it's not like there are only a few of them scattered throughout each level. There are 122 in total to collect. Even if you don't find or listen to them all, you're given just enough information to put the whole puzzle together by the time the notorious twist happens. Aside from the audio diaries to inform you about the story's exposition, you can also see phantoms of Rapture's citizens to see what their life was like before, during, and after the fall. The game even gives a thematic explanation as to why you see these visions. I think it's a nice touch to give the player even more insight into the lives of the people that were here before you. I love how much effort this game puts into even the most minor of characters. Although all of these people have perished in this failed adult science experiment, they elevate the likability of the city tenfold, and playing the game without their input would make it much more bland and lifeless. The many faces of Rapture brought their individual talents to the table in order for their new city to prosper, but they can only be as successful as their leader. And unlike most of the one-dimensional, cookie-cutter antagonists that most games end up trying to pass off as brilliant, BioShock provides the omniverse of video games with the most intelligent and dangerous type of villain, the kind with vision.
I chose the impossible. I chose Rapture. The artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, Rapture can become your city as well.
What a way to introduce the setting. The epic empire of egoism is more than just a good hiding place for a secret society or a freak accident that was birthed from the mind of a god or deity. It's a philosophy, an extreme ideology that was brought about by a man of wealth and power, a man of ambition and hard work, a man who chooses. Andrew Ryan is the founding father of Rapture with an immense business intellect, a will of steel, and is ultimately a personification of Objectivism. It's a school of thought that was developed by Russian-American writer Ayn Rand that puts the rights and well-being of the individual above all else. Ryan's upbringings in Russia and the United States led him to harbor intense feelings of anger and frustration towards communism and capitalism respectively. It lit the fire inside him that would burn furiously throughout his adult years. He spends a hefty amount of time building Rapture in obscurity to make sure no one gets in the way of his plans, gathering his most trusted friends and the brightest minds from around the world to optimize Rapture's potential. Once the engineering marvel was finished, the city and its people immediately hit the ground running. The advancements in technology and science down in Rapture are leagues ahead of what's on the outside world. Its economy wasn't restricted by any sort of government oversight, and moral responsibility was completely out of the question. In the beginning, having no rules was Rapture's greatest strength, but it wouldn't take long for it to inevitably turn into its greatest weakness, as this same set of beliefs would eventually make the city pull an Uno reverse card on itself. The major turning point and overall peak of the city would be when German scientist Dr. Brigitte Tenenbaum discovers Adam, a genetic material that is carried by sea slugs on the ocean floor. Using this special slime, the people of Rapture were easily able to change their genetics and create plasmids to shoot electricity, fire and ice from the palm of their hands. This doesn't mean they wouldn't be without their downsides, however. Repeated consumption of Adam will cause the user to become extremely addicted, and the demand quickly outgrew the supply. This is where Frank Fontaine comes in, the criminal mastermind that would be one of the key figures in bringing Andrew Ryan and his city to their knees. He was the head of his own business, Fontaine Futuristics, and was incredibly successful, being the best in town with no competition when it comes to plasmid production and sales. To keep up with the people's never-ending hunger for Adam, he opens the Little Sisters Orphanage as a red herring to experiment on kidnapped orphan girls, as it was discovered that if the sea slugs were surgically planted into the subject of the host, there would be a guaranteed 20 to 30 times increase in Adam. Even though they would become near indestructible because of Adam's incredible healing factor, splicers would always be on the hunt to take the Little Sister sea slugs for themselves. Thus, the Big Daddies were created. Political prisoners turned into eldritch, brainwashed zombies for the rest of their miserable existence in order to ensure the safe retrieval of the Adam gathered by the Little Sisters. Although you can hear the hesitant guilt in Ryan's voice, he still tries to justify the creation of the girls by basically placing part of the blame on them, suggesting that they had the mental capacity to make the decision for themselves for the quote-unquote good of Rapture.
The children, with their very long needles, their tuneless songs, their ghastly errands, their ghoulish Frankenstein fathers. But we've all placed our hand on the great chain of endeavor. My hand is on it. Fontaine's is on it. We all pull it and are pulled by it. Yes, these children are an abomination. But it is not my hand alone on the chain that created them. No. Their little fingers were right there, next to mine.
Forcibly shoehorning adults and children who were frowned upon and considered at the bottom of the pecking order into a permanent symbiotic link would be one of Rapture's greatest sins. But it would ultimately accelerate Frank Fontaine's rise to power that overshadowed everyone, even Andrew Ryan. At first, Fontaine's hustle was approved and respected by Ryan, as he stayed true to his beliefs, but it wouldn't take long for this rapid Fontaine takeover to get under Ryan's skin and lead him to turn into the very things he despised and fled from. As the skepticism of Fontaine's motives increased in Ryan's mind, so did his investigations into Fontaine's business, becoming more thorough and extreme. Eventually, Fontaine is killed in a shootout with Ryan's men, and soon after, Ryan himself nationalizes Fontaine Futuristics to further suppress the man's influence in the city. Many were not afraid to call out the bullshit that was this big government low blow coming from the guy that started this purely objectivist society, and correctly so. Before Rapture, Ryan bought a forest only to later burn it down to prevent Congress from turning it into a public park. This would be the first of many hypocritical leadership decisions made by Ryan, as the newly, steadily growing pressure from Atlas would send Rapture into a civil war and push him beyond the brink of madness. The relatable, hard-working common man was more than capable of rallying soldiers to fight for his cause. They protested against the nationalization of Fontaine Futuristics and coordinated violent ambushes on Rapture's general public, like the New Year's attack in 1958. Atlas proved himself to be an even more formidable foe than Fontaine, and pushed Ryan into a corner, so much so that his own allies like McDonough formulated plans to put a big fat X on his name. In a manic rage, Ryan doesn't even hesitate to go against every single rule that are considered the building blocks of his seemingly absolute worldview. He puts a hit out on a singer named Anna Culpepper for criticizing him in her songs. He dishes out the death penalty to anyone who is caught smuggling anything and or anyone from the outside, and most shocking and disturbing of all, he laces his own plasmids with pheromones that can turn anyone who uses them into a mindless, obedient slave.
Dr. Suchong, frankly, I'm shocked by your proposal. If we were to modify the structure of our commercial plasmid line as you propose, to have them make the user vulnerable to mental suggestion through pheromones, would we not be able to effectively control the actions of the citizens of Rapture? Free will is the cornerstone of this city. The thought of sacrificing it is abhorrent. However, we are indeed in a time of war. If Atlas and his bandits have their way, will they not turn us into slaves? And what will become of free will then? Desperate times call for desperate measures.
In true fascist dictator fashion, Ryan silences and censors any and all voices who disagree with him through their art. He outright kills people for risking any sort of exposure to the rest of the world, and completely extinguishes the free will of his own people, only to use them as pawns in his chess game. Not only does this make Andrew Ryan a brilliantly evil villain, but it also shows that he's not as perfect as you'd like to believe a man of his stature could be. He's actually devilishly flawed, clearly brought to light and made evident by the one thing that is, ironically, at the center of his belief system: his ego. What he had faith in the most was the same thing that would be his ultimate downfall, his tragic flaw, so to speak. His pride couldn't deal with others like Fontaine overthrowing him at the top of Rapture Mountain, disregarding all the rules he set for his life's journey and his city's foundation. He's not some all-powerful god or king who laughs maniacally at the damage he's caused. He truly wanted his way to work. So much so to the point that he doubts himself and reevaluates his actions, even if it's for a brief moment.
Could I have made mistakes? One does not build cities if one is guided by doubt. But can one govern in absolute certainty? I know that my beliefs have elevated me just as I know that the things I have rejected would have destroyed me. But the city, it's collapsing before my... Have I become so convinced by my own beliefs that I have stopped seeing the truth? Perhaps. But Atlas is out there, and he aims to destroy me and to destroy my city. To question is to surrender. I will not question.
Soon after, the game begins in the year 1960, where we are introduced to Jack, a seemingly average Joe who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. His plane ride ends abruptly when it crashes right next to Rapture's entrance, and he luckily pairs up with Atlas to guide him to safety and rescue his new partner's wife and son. Along your suicide mission, you learn about and delve deeper into the thoughts of Rapture's most wanted and Andrew Ryan's closest associates. The more important ones like Diane McClintock, Sullivan, and McDonough start off in love with and loyal to Ryan respectively, but eventually disagree with his leadership and turn on him over time. McClintock was one of Ryan's love interests, who is constantly led on and stood up, especially after the New Year's attack in '58. She takes notice of Ryan's corrupt actions and joins up with Atlas, only to be killed by him later. Sullivan was Ryan's chief of security on the surface and in Rapture, and makes for a vicious attack dog. He casually helps program the bathyspheres with Ryan's genetic code and brutally interrogates Frank Fontaine's goons without question. But as Ryan's demands became more irrational and hilariously childish, his what the fuck meter multiplies, and after he reluctantly puts the bump on Anna Culpepper, his last audio diary sprinkles hints that he committed suicide. Bill McDonough was Rapture's general contractor, and he sits on the city council to provide a level-headed voice for Ryan. He sternly keeps the people's ignorance in check to prevent the city from physically leaking and collapsing. He advises Ryan to stay true to his ideals by not taking over Fontaine's business after they arrest him. When Ryan does the complete opposite, McDonough resigns from his position and makes plans with others to take Ryan out, unfortunately being murdered and nailed to a wall in Hephaestus. And even more melancholy, as the book reveals, he left his wife and daughter behind. Not many games at the time, or even today, put this much effort into their side characters, nor do they deliver the lore in such a refreshing and charismatic way. And it's not just the audio diary characters that get all the credit here. Splicers move around each level in an organic way and babble on with their comedic quotes and top-notch whistling, a delicious taste of how great the voice acting is in BioShock. Both the levels and their inhabitants possess limitless personality. Even the announcements you hear over the PA still have me giggling like a toddler. In addition to the audio diaries, splicers, and general announcements, the radio messages are great too, with my favorites being from the devil himself. Sharp, witty, and a huge asshole, being perfectly portrayed by Armin Shimmerman as well. The man cuts deep and steals the show every time he pops up on your device.
Rapture isn't some sunken ship for you to plunder, and Andrew Ryan isn't a giddy socialite who could be slapped around by government muscle.
Even the air you breathe is sponged from my account. Well, breathe deep. So later you might remember the taste. I haven't chosen the spot for you on the wall yet. Let me know if you have a preference. You belong to Atlas, the one roach I can't seem to exterminate. Don't worry. I just need time to find the proper poison. A season for all things. A time to live and a time to die. A time to build and a time to destroy!
My favorite piece of dialogue from not just Ryan, but in the whole game is right after you enter Rapture Central Control. Despite his failures and shortcomings, the captain shows no fear and is more than willing to go down with his ship, and his rage rises to new heights. I could go on for a while about every character from BioShock, but I think you get the point. I just never get tired of them. But while the voices in Rapture are wildly beautiful and lively, you'll learn that most of the places they were in were the complete opposite. It doesn't take long for you to realize that not all of Rapture's citizens were benefiting from placing their hand on the Great Chain, specifically the working class. Through BioShock's environments and audio diaries, it thoroughly displays the major problems with Objectivism in that it puts a much heavier strain on people at the bottom compared to the ones at the top. Even in a society with free markets and no ethical and artistic restraints, the dirty work doesn't just magically go away, and not everyone can thrive at the same level. Criminals like Fontaine will take advantage of the fact that the rules have been disregarded faster than my parents ruined their marriage, and people existing in this living space will stoop low to catch up with the wealthy. Take Jasmine Jolene, for instance, who was a burlesque dancer at Eve's Garden in Fort Frolic and was one of Ryan's side pieces. She sold her unborn child to Fontaine because she was desperate for some quick cash, only to be brutally murdered by Ryan after the tea was spilled. So, we have a game that contains creative environments that are home to a plethora of characters who share an electrifying chemistry with one another, most possessing entire character arcs to flesh them out even more, and a stern, truthful picture depicting the dangers and drawbacks of Objectivism. How could things get any more exciting and interesting? How can this game possibly elevate its story and overall experience to an entire new level that would cement it as a cultural landmark in video game history? Well, I'll let BioShock speak for itself.
From now, my child, there is one final thing to discuss.
What? Ryan set the core to self-destruct. This is different than what you did. He's got a mind to take down the whole damn city. Get in there and whack the chunk before the whole joint blows!
This is how. This is what makes BioShock an even more gut-wrenching and meaningful game. Talk about a plot twist. It is so unbelievably effective because there are a few layers to it. The rug is completely and swiftly pulled out from under you and redefines your entire journey up to this point. No one expected Jack to be this involved in the war between Atlas and Ryan. The game drops a myriad of small hints throughout Rapture about who you are and where you come from, whether they're through audio diaries like Sullivan talking about the Ryan exclusive bathyspheres and Jasmine Jolene panicking about Fontaine buying her child, or from Ryan himself after he figures out that you're affiliated with Atlas. You are the bastard child of Andrew Ryan and Jasmine Jolene, the same fetus that I just talked about a minute ago. Suchong recreated you to be a monstrous robot that can effortlessly follow any and all orders. And this is where the "would you kindly" catchphrase comes into play. You think that it's just a cute little character trait of Atlas, but it's actually the key to controlling Jack and has been used on you throughout the entire game. Jack would later be sent up to the surface as a sleeper agent after his conditioning was complete, and when the time came, he took a plane that leads to Rapture and shot the pilot at the exact coordinates of the lighthouse, with "would you kindly" being written on the damn gift box. Being the only one to precede the Ryan bloodline, Jack would be able to access the bathyspheres and travel anywhere in Rapture without issue, as they are embedded with Ryan's genetics, meaning only he or someone with his DNA could use them. Fontaine knew this and planned ahead. As he puts it, Jack was his ace in the hole. It is so deviously genius to see him get the upper hand on Ryan like this. The man you thought was the smartest and most powerful in any room he stepped in was actually bamboozled in the most satisfying way imaginable. This whole debacle is also a great example of a silent protagonist done right. It puts you in Jack's shoes and makes the twist an even bigger kick in the dick. And in this regard, it's not just Jack that's being controlled. It can also apply to the player as well, as you've been more than inclined to blindly assist Atlas and calmly comply with his demands. BioShock disturbingly shatters the fourth wall and shows how us average video game consumers are zombified and really don't think about what we're actually doing, other than get from point A to point B. You really do feel used and abused worse than Adriana Chechik on an episode of Blacked and say to yourself, holy shit, that was so fucking big. Ultimately, BioShock makes you ask the golden question: are you a man or a slave? But that's not the end of the world-shattering revelation you find yourself in. If Atlas knows the "would you kindly" command, how come he's not on the wall in Ryan's office with Fontaine, Suchong, and Tenenbaum? By this point, you're given more than enough information to connect the dots and discover Atlas's true identity. And once you put 2 and 2 together, you'll shit your invisible pants.
Stop, would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find it? Would you kindly find it? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
Fontaine faked his death in his final standoff with Ryan's police force, and portrayed himself as Atlas afterward to take advantage of Ryan's increasing madness and put even more political pressure on him. It worked like a charm, as Atlas was a strategic and courageous leader, and Ryan was too weak to stay true to his ideology and committed unspeakable acts against his people to try and win the Civil War. The final nail in the coffin would be to use Ryan's own son against him, summoning Jack back to Rapture from topside and killing his father after infiltrating the city. Jack proceeds to fall prey to one last "would you kindly," and Fontaine takes control of Rapture, with Tenenbaum becoming your new ally. The revelation that the character you've been playing as has been manipulated and toyed with just as badly as the big daddies and little sisters is heartbreaking. It makes you feel sick knowing that you couldn't even get out of the womb before the cuckoo Chinaman started rearranging every literal fiber of your being, making you into an even bigger freak show than the 2 pieces of nightmare fuel on the cover of the fucking game. You are not just some random guy from a faraway land. It's not a coincidence. It turns out that you have been taken advantage of and exploited the most out of everyone in Rapture. Frank Fontaine might be more of a stereotypical gangster in the eyes of most, but he's still perfectly voice acted and chock full of personality. I would actually argue that there's quite a bit of depth to his character. He is the quintessential parasite, someone that embodied everything that Andrew Ryan fled from and tried to eliminate. Even in Ryan's perfect society, men like Fontaine will always be lurking in the shadows, waiting to put their scheming to good use. And Fontaine himself knocked Ryan off of his moral high ground and exposed him for who he truly is. An insecure, self-righteous hypocrite that turned into the very thing he fought so desperately to be the opposite of. But then there's the final boss, and the game's only real boss in general, and it's amazing. It's amazing how much of a pushover it is. The fight with Frank Fontaine has always reminded me of the one with the Joker from Batman Arkham Asylum that would actually release 2 years after BioShock. Great game, but the final boss is like a grown adult diving headfirst into the shallow end of a kiddie pool. Even on the hardest difficulty, it's really tough to die here. The room you fight in is wide open, and you've got all the weapons and plasmids upgraded to the fullest extent to breeze past it without a whole lot of trouble. There's really not that much I have to say, other than I would have liked if Fontaine broke from his chair as soon as you enter the room and the fight would start immediately, rather than getting one of his jelly jars for free and only having to drain his jam 3 or more times afterward. Disappointing is an understatement, but at least it could be worse. Once you defeat him, the ending plays out based on how you interacted with the little sisters. If you harvest even one of them, you get the bad ending, regardless if you rescue the rest. The only difference between the 2 types of bad endings that are possible to achieve is that Tenenbaum will speak in a more somber tone if you kill one, but save the rest. If you kill them all, she sounds more angry. This is as close to a middle ground as you can get, unfortunately. In it, you run Rapture tits to toes and use your nuclear warheads to devastate the planet. Because whatever. Since when did Ryan, Fontaine, or even you have any intentions of causing mass destruction on a global scale? And where the hell did these rockets come from? I've never heard them mentioned in the game at all. They just come out of nowhere right at the end, and it's really goofy. BioShock's pretentious moral choice system hard at work, as you can clearly see. The good ending is much better, and, in my opinion, is the real ending to the game. It possesses much more emotional depth and has a stronger tie to the narrative. If you rescue all the little sisters, you take 5 of them to the surface and give them a chance to experience a normal life. They graduate college, get married, and have children of their own. Jack then receives that love back in his final moments, and for the first time, being a part of a real family. It's beautiful that 2 groups of some of the most exploited people in Rapture were rewarded with the things that the same selfish society took from them. Jack reflects the big daddies, literally becoming one to the little sisters in the end. They were both ruthlessly experimented on and forced to do the dirty work of a world that they were wrongfully shoved into. And despite the fact that Jack was physically robbed of everything that makes him a man, he was more than just a machine by saving the girls. He showed that there was a human underneath it all, even though his brain was turned to mush and sculpted back up again. Even though he had a tattoo of the Great Chain on his wrist, symbolizing him as a permanent inmate of Rapture, he rose above the dark, corrupt past of his parents and home, proving his captors and even his own father wrong, who looked at Jack as an ultimate mistake. He really was his father's son, wasn't he? Despite the circumstances of his birth, the fact that his whole life on the surface was a lie, what people like Fontaine said about him, Jack drove by the fork in the road and went straight. He chose. That was a mouthful, but it was well worth the discussion. Even after all these years, BioShock continues to stand the test of time as being one of the best games to be released, and stand out among all of its successors. It was the first video game to tackle topics like science, morality, and politics in a serious fashion amidst its contemporaries that started a mechanical revolution in the medium. The way it plays may not have aged well, and the writing isn't perfect despite all the praise I just threw at it, but it is undeniably unique and disgustingly creative. Its world is beautifully cohesive and believable, housing characters that are overflowing with personality. Its method of storytelling is vastly superior to countless amounts of AAA movie games that have swallowed the audience in popularity in the present day. It doesn't shove a blinding amount of cutscenes down your throat or hold your hand to help you understand the story being told. It uses its brilliantly crafted surroundings and audio diaries to drop hints about what will eventually unfold, letting the player figure things out and discover for themselves. And while I think the sequel polished and slickened the overall gameplay and systems in every way, the main game, as well as this overrated pile of schlock, failed to capture that same thematic magic again. Only one other piece of BioShock content can even remotely compare and live up to the first installment. But for me personally, you can't beat the original. It's a slice of media so good that it didn't need a sequel. I never thought in my wildest dreams that a scuba diver and a young girl I saw at a local GameStop when I was a kid would have such a profound effect on me, and would open a realm of factual and fictional possibility in my mind that I never thought possible. From start to finish, through all the twists and turns, ups and downs, and everything in between, BioShock is one of my favorite video games of all time. I'm turning 24 years old this year, on Memorial Day actually, and after recently going through tough times, having some revelations about myself and my personal life, I can't help but wonder if it was my destiny to finish this long overdue video now, as opposed to when I had originally planned. It's almost as if the universe knew that I would lose my way, and would later call me back like Fontaine did Jack, to show me who I am and what I'm capable of, to remind me that I'm not a prisoner to my past mistakes and bad habits, to remind me that I'm someone who strives to improve my situation every day, work hard in order to obtain the life that I desire, and practice the art of forgiving others, as well as myself. I own 3 different copies of BioShock and have played it at least once a year for the past 4 years. But now, after everything I've been through in my year 2.5 decades on Earth, and crafting this big-ass retrospective, I can truly relate to Andrew Ryan's message. I'm not a slave anymore. I'm a man who chooses.
Son of a bitch.
The unrelenting success of BioShock meant that it was only a matter of time before a sequel would be on the way. And even though the big daddy and little sister had more than enough time to shine, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't be back for more. In fact, you are the mechanized menace this time around, of course being accompanied by your eldritch infants, raring to take on the splicers and your fellow Mr. Bs once again. You hear that? My childhood friends are calling. I think it's time I head back down to Rapture for round 2.